So, how do you win at diplomacy? It seems like an easy question to answer. Win 18 supply centers and you win the game. But the answer is much more complex because this game is very nuanced. Players' goals evolve as their chances of a solo dwindle, and draws are a valid endgame result. Diplomacy is not only about winning, it's also about not losing. This video is going to analyze what the best outcomes are in the game from first to worst. This is Legendary Tactics. The definition of winning in diplomacy comes down to what the agreed upon victory condition is by those playing or by the tournament director. In some cases, such as with Carnage scoring, you're simply trying to have the highest SC or supply center count when all players agree to a draw. In some gaming groups, like my own, all that matters is who is the last player standing or who ends up with the most centers. We will sometimes stipulate that the game can't end until there are 3 or fewer powers left on the board, but often games are played until there is a solo. What's unique about the game of diplomacy is how different gaming groups have different definitions of what success looks like and what's considered a win. In some tournaments, the winner is the SC leader after a specified number of game years, but there's a problem with all of these. If you're not winning the game, what is the point of continuing to play? And that's where secondary and tertiary objectives become important. In the Media Wars game that I recently played, I asked Zachary Moore, who was representing the Diplomacy Broadcast Network and playing as England, what his thoughts were on the endgame outcomes at a point when he was nearing his end. He laid it out this way, saying he likes to move through a progression of goals as the game develops. Number 1, solo. Number 2, top. Number 3, draw or survive. And 4, punish enemies. Part of the challenge of defining what constitutes a win in this game is that after the first 12 centers are captured, it becomes a zero-sum game. So how do you achieve success in a game where it becomes a tug of war? So I'd like to extend Zachary's list a little to this. Number 1 goal is to solo. After that, you'd like to top. Number 3 is to survive or draw, and the fewer in the draw, the better, in my mind. Number 4, you may be defeated by the solo. After that, we've got a player who's going to be eliminated, but before they do that, they get the revenge on somebody. And right down there at the bottom is the early elimination. Somebody's got to go out first, and unfortunately, that's probably the worst result in the game. Let's move to the first of these, the solo. The solo is the ultimate, unquestionably best outcome in a game of diplomacy. If you can outplay all the other nations on the board, cross the stalemate line, and claim that 18th center, then you should revel in the glory of your win. Backstabber shows me that I've soloed 7 of my last 21 games. I think this is a little unnatural because of my group's favoritism towards solo victories. I haven't got any idea if this is good or not, but I have a feeling that solo victories are not all that common. It's a clear indication, too, that when I play, I either go for the solo or I go for defeat, which isn't actually ideal in the game of diplomacy because there is a nice middle ground. We'll get to that later. But perhaps my myopic view of the game, as either win or lose, should evolve more to accept other consolation prizes more often. Next, we have the board top. So one problem with Carnage scoring or setting arbitrary end years is that there's often a lot of game left to be played. And very frequently, in my mind, this is the best part of the game left when at the end when the draw is called. But in the interest of tournaments not taking too long, it's what they need to use. I would consider board topping the equivalent to being ahead at the end of the mid-game. Another issue with this kind of scoring is that you can win the war without really winning the battles. This result doesn't necessarily mean that you're on a trajectory to be the number 1 SC count on the board at game's end, but just that you're big enough to scare the next biggest SC leader into not attacking you and accepting that they have done as well as they can at the moment. One complication of tournament scoring systems is that a win by France is scored the exact same way as a win by Italy most of the time, though the latter is much harder to achieve. Tribute scoring in some ways remedies some of these issues. Next, let's move to the draw, the famous draw. In the Media Wars game, Captain Meme offered me a quote from the designer of diplomacy, Alan Kalmer, as he was working to mobilize the remaining powers to prevent the solo by Germany. Kalmer said, "This final attempt to contain the leader is sometimes one of the most dramatic and exciting parts of the game. Cooperation must be created among players who have been fighting one another and who have set their hearts on their objectives. They must admit that the goal they have pursued all game long, which are now within their grasp, have just lost their value, and may even be destructive. Frequently, they are out of position for the new encounter and are better positioned to fight each other. They must form a line together, exposing their territories to each other. This is not the cooperation of merely being assigned to the same team. This cooperation is hard won over difficulties. This is Verdun. So in this particular game, we're really holding up against the German tidal wave here that will inevitably come. But I've always struggled with accepting draws as a valid part of this game. When 6 people all tie, it seems like a wasted effort to me. Why play if everyone is going to tie? It's like soccer camp where every kid gets a trophy, which actually means that no kid gets a trophy. But I'm being forced to reconcile that I need to change my perspective on what the ultimate outcome of a diplomacy game is, because this game is completely unlike any other game where there's usually just one winner in a game. There are other ways to win this game. So if 5 players achieve a draw, do they all share in that draw equally? Well, I guess it depends on how it's scored. But if one player has 15 centers and another has 2, have those 2 players tied? Do they get rewarded equally for that? So this seems like a bit of a gray area in the game. In my mind, a scoring system should reward players for shortening the draw pool. If we reflect back on Kalmar, he's suggesting that once there's a runaway leader, the rest of the nations should unite. And he also believes that there's more onus on the bigger powers to unite and to stop that solo artist from winning. So he disagrees with my way of viewing the game, and I'm probably wrong because he did design the game. So, but I can't help fighting against that feeling that a draw seems like highway robbery. So remember that diplomacy is a game in which the victor is the person with the majority of points, not the most points. So having 17 points while everyone else has far fewer points, that doesn't make you a winner unless you get the 18th point. Diplomacy is unique in that the draw state is much like a stalemate in chess. It's actually a valid part of the game, but whether you prefer draw size scoring, which means everyone in a draw gets equal points, or the sum of squares scoring, which rewards players for having more centers, that really depends on why you play the game. Is it for total domination and outperforming everyone else, or are you playing for a draw once you can no longer solo? To be clear, I think both are valid. They're just different objectives, and that needs to be established at the outset of a game. Even Backstabber acknowledges the oddity of the end result in diplomacy as you get emailed a message that says, "Congratulations on your not failure." And I guess this just simulates real conflict where not dying is in fact a huge victory, even if someone else's military defeats your own. So let's just consider this like a tactical retreat. Live to fight another day. Let's move on to a defeat. As a clear leader begins to emerge in the game, the race to the stalemate line starts. But you don't always stop in fighting in time. Sometimes units are tactically ill-positioned to get there, and others may simply not be able to outplay the board leader. Some players may decide to throw the game as well and let the leader take the win. Maybe they feel they deserve it through their diplomacy or through their play through the game. Or maybe the other people, they just can't get over and forgive them. But remember, this can be part of a diplomatic win for the person going for the solo. And it isn't necessarily always to be frowned upon. But I consider this rather like the contestants on the TV show Survivor coming back to haunt those who put them out in the first place. You may get your Machiavellian advantage with a stab at an early point in the game, but it may not carry you through to the solo in the late game. And this is why it often pays not to lie openly and not to stab too often or deeply in this game. So let's move on to the revenge plot. I believe that revenge is a product of the interactions of the game. It doesn't just come for no good reasons. Some players fail to see that the way they communicate and the subsequent follow-through or lack thereof by other players will set players up to either like or dislike you throughout the game. And ultimately, when it comes to the end of the game, it may come down to who do your opponents, even if they only have a single unit left, who do they like more and who do they want to throw in with? So the way you treat your opponents will shape the way they inevitably treat you. This is why if you're planning a brutal stab, you better get it right, because if you don't, karma will pay you a visit later in the game. You can see in the Media Wars game here that England went all in against France and left himself way out of position, and he's just continuing to work his way around as part of his revenge plot. And now as Germany's attacking him, now he needs to get his revenge against Germany. And you know what? This can be a really fun part of the game too. You know you're going down, you might as well go down in a blaze of glory. And so that's why I've ranked the revenge elimination slightly higher than just the elimination without really getting much gameplay. So that brings us to the last stage of the game, and this is the early elimination. I believe this is the worst outcome in the game of diplomacy, to be eliminated first. Some people might try to convince you that all eliminations end up with the same score of 0, and again, that comes down to how you score your game. But we all know that secretly, being the first out is the worst. But don't worry, it's not necessarily a reflection on your skill if you were put out first. Some games just go south from the outset, and it's hard to shift people's minds if they come to the game with a particular mindset. But remember, if you have a chip and a chair, you're still in the game. If it looks like you're the unwitting victim of a gank, just take your medicine, survive as long as you can, maybe even appeal to the emotions of the other players. Make them feel sorry for you that you're getting put out with ever really getting a chance to play. But never, ever give up. At least there's honor in how you choose to leave the game. In conclusion, one unique feature of this game is that it's so customizable, with minor variations in how you play the scoring. How your gaming group or your tournament director chooses to score the game will completely alter how the game is played. Fundamentally, I mean, this game changes drastically based on what players' goals and outcomes and desires are for that endgame. For me, I play a little bit existentially, where all I'm trying to do is get the best outcome from each turn possible. And if that means stopping the solo player from winning the game, then that's what I need to do. If it's me surviving to stay in the game so I get part of the draw, then that's what I go for. I know of few other games whose underlying tactics change so dramatically when you adjust the scoring method. But perhaps this is the reason that the game still feels so fresh after 60 years. So, choose the method that you enjoy the most, and good luck with those solo wins. If this video was helpful to you, please consider liking it and joining us at Legendary Tactics by subscribing. We'd love to have you back when you can stay a little longer. We've got a whole playlist of other diplomacy videos for you to check out just a click away. Thanks for your time.